Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar on measuring and reducing embodied emissions with a focus on construction materials like steel and concrete. I'm Chris Kardish, the Industrial Decarbonization Fellow at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, or C2ES. I'll be your moderator today. Just as a reminder, you can submit questions throughout this webinar using the Q&A function on your screen. We'll do our very best to get to as many of them as possible at the end. If you have any technical challenges or comments for us, you can email us at webinar@c2es.org. So to quickly kind of go over what you're going to see today, I'll begin with a presentation based on a recent C2ES paper on embodied emissions reporting that you can find online now. I'm aiming to sort of familiarize everyone with the terminology and the issues we're focused on today. We'll then hear from Jetta Wong of the General Services Administration on her agency's policies focused on reducing emissions embodied in the built environment, which is especially relevant given GSA's nickname as the federal government's landlord. Next, we'll have a panel discussion with three very capable people who bring different expertise on this topic. I'll introduce them properly later. So let's start things off with the basics. When we talk about embodied emissions or embodied carbon, and I'll use those terms interchangeably, we mean the emissions generated across the stages of a product's life cycle. Very often people are referring exclusively to the stages around manufacturing of the product, including raw materials needed for that production. This is a big chunk of emissions. About 11% of global emissions come from goods used to construct buildings and infrastructure. So materials like steel and cement are both incredibly emissions intensive and ever present in our economies. So those two sectors alone account for about 15% of global emissions. So embodied emissions are those in materials we purchase or consume. And so actions to address them often fall on the demand side. And this is especially true of BiClean policies, which set rules on the carbon content of materials used for public projects to encourage a broader transition toward greener products. There's good reason for attention on public procurement, since about 32% of embodied emissions in the US come from public projects. The challenge, however, is that any policy targeting embodied carbon requires data that allows you to reliably compare the emissions between manufacturers. The leading method of verifying a product's embodied carbon in the US is through an environmental product declaration, or EPD. So EPDs are standardized documents that quantify environmental impacts, a host of impacts, including CO2 equivalent emissions per unit of the product, referred to as global warming potential, or GWP. So the overarching guidelines are set by the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO. You can think of these as the broader principles that could apply to any product. Then product category rules, or PCRs, spell out more detailed product-specific reporting rules. They're developed through consultations with stakeholders, including manufacturers themselves, and administered by a program operator, which is often a company that specializes in third-party verification. To be comparable, EPDs must be produced under the same product category rules. Otherwise, the same product might have different results in a life cycle analysis. There are different types of EPDs, some of which have emerged through BiClean laws. Industry-wide EPDs give an average for a group of manufacturers, so they're often produced by trade associations, and they're useful for benchmarking, so setting a minimum allowable emissions level of materials used in projects. California relied a lot on industry-wide EPDs in setting benchmarks for their BiClean law. Then product-specific EPDs are specific to an individual manufacturer, though the data may be averaged across multiple facilities. A facility-specific EPD goes a step further than the product one and is linked to the performance of a specific facility of manufacture, like it sounds. This was introduced in the BiClean California Act. And then lastly, supply chain specific EPDs require actual or primary data for major upstream inputs or precursors. So an example would be requiring a concrete manufacturer to use actual data for the cement they use rather than an average from a life cycle database, because the cement accounts for the vast majority of emissions in concrete. EPDs contain a mix of primary data and generic or secondary data pulled from lifecycle databases simply because there are too many aspects to report on to be able to use actual data all the time. In this term, supply supply chain specific EPDs was proposed in the BiClean, BiFair Washington Act. The most active area of policymaking on embodied carbon is the BiClean movement. The table you see here is an abbreviated version of the one that appears in our report. California became the first state to enact a BiClean policy in 2017. Since then, most activities continue to be at the state level, but the city of Portland, Oregon was an early adopter, targeting concrete. We may see more policies emerging from cities in the years ahead. Then under the Biden administration, we've also seen major progress at the federal level, where the potential to scale BiClean is really significant. So the administration announced a BiClean task force in December 2021. Then GSA was the first federal agency to adopt a BiClean policy. You'll of course be hearing more about that. They issued procurement standards for concrete and asphalt in March 2022. More agencies and more products are likely to follow, since the administration is also prioritizing steel and flat glass. Then the Inflation Reduction Act included funding for the EPA to implement a program for enhanced standardization and transparency of EPDs, which we'll be talking about more later, and more than $4 billion for GSA and the Department of Transportation to pay for lower carbon materials. All the policies we've highlighted here tend to differ in terms of their product coverage and their requirements of the use of EPDs. While most policies cover concrete, California does not currently, but is considered legislation to add it and require a supply chain specific EPD. You'll also notice that there are differences in the types of EPDs required. Product specific are still the most common, but we may continue to see some divergence there. Then, while BiClean dominates current policymaking on embodied carbon, there are other areas we may see in the future. So one is on building code regulations, where Marin County in California was the first and so far only jurisdiction to incorporate embodied carbon regulations in building codes, but that could be an area of future development. Another area is in compliance with trade-based climate measures like border carbon adjustments, where instruments like EPDs could be used to verify a foreign company's emissions intensity. And then lastly, tools like EPDs could be used in the future for product carbon standards, which could be viewed as sort of a broadening of BiClean to be a mandatory policy holding all producers of covered products to a certain benchmark. So we need robust data to implement policies, but there are some ways that EPDs fall short. On the last slide coming up next, I'll talk about some things we can do about that. For many products, the majority of emissions occur during upstream life cycle phases, so from raw materials and precursor goods that are later used in the manufacturing process. But it's very common to use secondary or generic data from a life cycle inventory database rather than actual primary data, as I mentioned before. And this can make EPDs less useful in distinguishing performance between producers. Also, some products can have significant impacts at later stages of their life cycle, like during an operational phase or end of life. This is true for building insulation, for instance, which might have operational impacts on energy use. But EPDs often lack this data in later stages. And then there can be challenges with comparability. Even EPDs that follow the same product category rules can have incomparable results because they use different sources of secondary data or different life cycle assessment tools or software. California found this out when trying to set benchmarks with a collection of product-specific EPDs. Next, the availability of EPDs varies significantly by state and product. It tends to be highest in states that have been early movers on BiClean and other policies. But some materials have few EPDs even in those early mover states, like masonry and aluminum. This challenge with EPD availability is likely to be worse for states seeking special EPDs like facility or supply chain specific ones, since those requirements go beyond what's required in product category rules for the products. Then lastly, with different EPD requirements across different states and the federal government, there's a risk of creating a patchwork system that increases the cost of compliance for companies and hinders the scaling of EPD availability. So what are the options to address those challenges? First, updating product category rules to address data gaps. There's a need for primary data for processes that make up large portions of emissions, a threshold of around 80% of cradle to gate emissions. So through the point of production could make sense. Governments are in a position to do this through participation in PCR updates and through the EPD requirements they set in their laws. They can also support PCR updating processes financially or form their own. Then second, there are ways to improve comparability and consistency. Product category rules could do more to specify which secondary data sources and assessment tools can be used. Governments, again, are in a position to influence this, similarly as with the last point on data gaps. So there's also a need for funding to support the availability of secondary data in the US, since a lot of it currently comes from Europe. Then lastly, on the comparability and consistency point, the Inflation Reduction Act combined with President Biden's BiClean push provide a chance to harmonize EPD rules. And the federal government should continue convening states on this issue. Then third, governments play a critical role in supporting EPD availability by providing education, assistance, and financial incentives to manufacturers. This has already happened in places like California and Oregon, and it's envisioned through the EPA, but we're likely to need to see more of this, especially targeting small and mid-sized manufacturers. Then lastly, there are alternatives to EPDs that could help increase the availability of embodied carbon data. ISO also has standards for carbon footprinting, which is a much narrower reporting focus than EPDs and less burdensome. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol's product carbon standard relies on these ISO standards as one prominent example. One challenge, however, is you still need more granular product-specific reporting rules to allow for fair comparisons of carbon footprints. With that condensed introduction to this topic, I'd like to hand it over to Jetta Wong. As a senior advisor to the administrator on climate, she's very involved in implementing GSA's embodied carbon policies, and she has prepared a presentation for us.
Thank you so much, Chris. I think we're pulling up that presentation right now. Excellent. Thank you so much. All right. Well, first of all, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with this audience on GSA's low embodied carbon work, and really appreciate the work that everyone across the country has been doing to develop this really important market. So why don't we jump right into this? Could we have the next slide? Thank you. All right. So let's set the foundation here. I think everyone knows GSA has a really important role to play in shaping markets, and that we have a really big role to play in the federal climate response. We take a lot of guidance from the work that the White House has been doing, of course, from our executive, the EOs. But this is a whole government approach, as Chris was mentioning. It's really important that we are all in sync. And so a lot of that is happening through these different offices out of the White House, but also the individual relationships that the SMEs have at EPA, at GSA, DOT, and Energy that have been working on these issues for a very long time. And the way that GSA looks at its role is that we have a footprint of 370 million square feet of our buildings portfolio. We have the largest vehicle fleet in the country, 450,000 vehicles. And we spend more than $75 billion in annual contracts every year. So we know we have a very big role to play. And so the way that we look at this is in three different ways. The first thing is that we know that we can help create markets through the creation of standards, like we're going to talk about today, like the low embodied carbon materials, and demanding those products in the market. The second thing is that we know that we can help reduce risk by focusing on new products that we can demonstrate in our portfolio buildings, like through our Green Proving Ground program. And the third thing is that we know that we can make the market more transparent through our different tools that we provide around green procurement. And so we do all this with a whole government approach, which is really driving what we've been doing in the low embodied carbon space. So if we could go on to the next slide. A lot of this work, as Chris was saying, is coordinated through the BiClean initiative. We're really happy to say that we've been working with the other agencies to really understand how we impact the market. And again, as we already heard, this is important because we need to start standardizing these different kinds of standards and working with states and other industry players on how to do that. And we have a strategy really focused on, first of all, those 4 core products: steel, concrete, asphalt, and flat glass. And then really, in addition to that, how do we ensure that we're creating that data transparency through other rules and regulations that we're working on? So this framework really has helped us at GSA think through what we should be doing. Next slide, please. I think a lot of people already know this, but I'm going to talk a little bit about what we did previously and then get into some of the work that we're doing now. So as I mentioned, we have a great cohort and group of people in GSA and EPA DOT that have been working on embodied carbon for a long time. We work with industry quite a bit, especially through our advisory committee, where they wrote a letter to us that said, hey, we should be looking at low embodied carbon materials. We worked with industry experts and looked into the market to see where EPDs already existed, and decided that one of the first things we should focus on is concrete. And then we also knew that we were going to have the bill, the bipartisan infrastructure law funding, to do land ports of entry, where we were going to have a demand for new asphalt materials for these new projects. So that's how we kind of identified our first 2 materials. Of course, we did the RFIs and then announced that those activities and those standards in March of last year. And we then implemented them immediately in the funding for our bill. Can we go to the next slide? So as a reminder, the bipartisan infrastructure law was $3.4 billion for GSA. We acted very quickly to include those standards into the bid process, ensuring that we are making sure those requirements were part of the process when we were going to our construction companies and talking to them about what we were looking for. And while, it's a very difficult time right now as it relates to, escalation in costs because of inflation, what labor issues and supply chain issues, we are seeing that the market is able to meet these requirements. We haven't done any waivers. The compliance for ensuring that we have these standards and these new materials isn't increasing the cost of our projects. And we have some really great examples of where we've been working with small businesses to ensure that they are a part of this conversation on low embodied carbon materials. So for example, we had in Lukeville, Arizona, a small disadvantaged business provide 28 trucks of asphalt to one of our projects, which is a really big thing for a small business. And they met our asphalt standards. We're really proud of the work that we're doing to communicate these activities to the industry. So next slide. We didn't stop there, though. Of course, as everyone knows, there's also the Inflation Reduction Act, which provided an additional $3.375 billion to GSA. And as Administrator Carnahan likes to say, we had momentum, and now we have real money. And when we have momentum and money, we can do amazing things. And so let's just kind of walk through what the IRA has provided to GSA. Of course, it includes the $2.15 billion for low embodied carbon materials, an additional $975 million for emerging sustainable technologies, and then $250 million to convert buildings to high performance green buildings. When we first received this money, we said, okay, what should we do with these dollars? And the first thing we said was, no new fossil fuel equipment shall be installed in any of our buildings using IRA dollars. We do not want to perpetuate the use of fossil fuels in any of our buildings. So while that's not a low embodied carbon part of the conversation, it's really important as we're thinking about operational emissions and what we're doing to reduce our footprint. We then looked at the projects that we knew that we needed to do, and we said, okay, which ones are going to have low embodied carbon materials? And then we identified those projects and even announced them on December 19th last year of which ones were going to receive low embodied carbon material funding and emerging technology funding. So really excited about that first set of projects. And then can we go to the next slide to dive into the, thank you, the low embodied carbon fund specifically. This is important, and we are really open, as many people know, to learning how we can best implement these dollars, but we do have a plan. The first thing to remember is that timing is important. While the IRA provided 10 years of availability of funding for many of the programs that exist, the low embodied carbon funds only have 4 years to implement their dollars. So we need to obligate our dollars by September of 2026. So if you're thinking about a buildings project, it takes a long time to design a construction project, get a bid, and ensure that we're moving in the right direction to deploy these funds appropriately. So 4 years is really not a lot of time. So it's something to remember. The next thing is that the funds for low embodied carbon materials can only focus on those materials and the acquisition and use of those materials. So it's a very narrow category of what those funds can be used for. They have to be substantially lower than the industry average, which makes a lot of sense. And then we need to work with EPA to determine what is the methodology and how we are going to select these materials. And thankfully, because we have a really good relationship with EPA and DOT through the BiClean task force, we've already been able to figure out how we want to implement this low embodied carbon fund activity. So you'll hear more and more about this as we develop our projects, but the EPA interim determination has us focused on the top 20 best performing kinds of materials. So remember, we're talking about lowest greenhouse gas emitting products. If we cannot find that in the market, because as we know, the market is still developing, we can then use the funds on things that would be in the top 40%. And then if we can't do that, we would be able to go to better than industry average. But the idea is to incentivize the market to move to the lowest carbon emitting materials. And of course, in those 4 categories that we've already identified. So if we can go to the next slide, those 4 categories are really important to us because while GSA, obviously has this low embodied carbon material money, we also have full projects that we're trying to do. And we have very clear net zero operational goals that we're trying to meet. Those 4 products really make up the bottom of this pyramid in the enclosure. So think about our walls, our windows, our roofs. That's where concrete, glass, steel, and asphalt can come into play. But we need to stack our buckets of funding on top of each other. So we have low embodied carbon materials, and then we have emerging technologies that can replace our HVAC systems, potentially a little bit of money for renewables, and that will help us meet our net zero operational goals. But we need additional funds in addition to those 3 buckets to make a whole project. So we are stacking the IRA dollars on top of appropriated dollars to meet these net zero operational goals. And so if we go on to the next slide, we're learning by doing. We will be implementing these low embodied carbon materials, keeping in mind that we are trying to move up that pyramid to reach those operational goals as well. But we are feeding this information into what we're learning from EPA, or feeding this information into EPA's new programs, which were highlighted earlier by Chris. We are also looking at, again, how do we incentivize the lowest levels of greenhouse gas emissions from these products? So what are the incentive and performance-based contracting models that we can do that? And then we know that we need to continue to work with industry and NGOs and states because we do need to standardize and make sure we're all heading in the same direction. And that's where we've learned a lot from all of you. And so we want to continue to do that. And so I have an ask to this audience is that if you have good examples of incentive or performance-based contracting, please send them to me. We're very interested in understanding how we can get to those lowest levels of greenhouse gas emissions. And then I just want to throw out to the audience is like, is there an opportunity to use advanced purchase agreements to incentivize these new products in the market? We saw a lot of we saw this used in the COVID-19 vaccine. Maybe we can do this with low embodied carbon materials. So that's the last thing I have for you. So if you go to the next slide, you can see my email address. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're looking forward to working with everyone and I look forward to hearing what the panelists have to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jetta. Unfortunately, Jetta will not be able to stay for the Q&A, but she clearly means it when she says she wants you to reach out with some suggestions on the points that she raised, both of which are very salient. I'm now going to shift to a panel discussion. We're going to dive deeper into some of these questions around standardization and effectiveness of BiClean policies and how we can really be strategic. So I'll introduce our panelists now. First, we have Michael Lamond, who is the Vice President of Environment, Land, and Government Affairs at Holcim. Holcim is the largest cement manufacturer in the US and has a net zero goal validated by the Science Based Targets Initiative. Megan Lewis is a senior researcher at the Carbon Leadership Forum. It's an organization in Washington State focused on decarbonizing the built environment. They produce some of the best work out there on embodied carbon policy and have strongly influenced my own thinking, to be honest. So lastly, Josh Jacobs is the Director of Sustainability at WAP Sustainability, which is one of the largest providers of life cycle carbon analysis for organizations and companies in North America. So he was previously a director at UL Environment, which is one of the leading EPD program operators and verifiers in North America. So, and keep in mind, audience, you can continue to submit questions in the Q&A, and we will get to those for the last 10 minutes or so. I did want to start it off with the EPA's role in the future of BiClean. They have $250 million through the IRA to support the development, enhanced standardization and transparency and reporting criteria for EPDs. Also funding to do some of the labeling that Jetta was referring to. So what are the things that this program needs to focus on to really advance policymaking that relies on embodied carbon data like BiClean initiatives? And we'll start with Megan, then I'll just cycle through.
Thanks, Chris. And thanks for the invitation. Really excited for this panel. So I think for the EPA program, and as Chris mentioned, there are the two programs. So one focused on creating low carbon standards and labeling. So I'm talking about the one focusing on supporting standardization and transparency for EPDs. And we see three key areas really for this program to tackle. The first, which we've already talked about, is supporting better EPDs with higher data quality and comparability. And so one of the first steps, I think, for that is to adopting clear standards for what PCRs will be accepted for federal procurement. It sends a really strong message about data quality and PCRs. Another area is just helping make EPDs faster and cheaper for manufacturers to make. This one's a little trickier. One of the key areas is supporting publicly available high quality background data to go into the LCAs and EPDs that are used in procurement. Another area I think would be supporting development of tools like those that already exist for concrete and asphalt to, again, make this easier for suppliers to do. And I think the third area, which Chris, you touched on a little bit, is exploring opportunities to include whether that's additional life cycle stages or leveraging other environmental impacts that are in EPDs. There's a lot more than just carbon in EPDs. That work is being done. Can the EPA look at those and evaluate which are ready for policy? So one example is that local and regional pollution impacts are already reported in EPD, and that ties a lot to environmental justice goals. So just looking at whether there's other opportunities within them, whether those are really ready for policy or not. Thanks
so much, Megan. It's a great lead off. Let's go to Michael next, and then we'll have see what Josh has to say.
All right, thank you, Chris, and like Megan said, I'm very, very happy to be here as part of the panel today. For Holcim, in general, the government, and when I say government, I mean the federal government, state government, and local governments, is the biggest customer that we have in the United States. So they have an incredible amount of leverage when it comes to products that they buy. They typically buy in bulk. They typically buy on plan, and that provides great certainty to business from a planning perspective. But often, and this is one area that Jetta spoke about, they typically buy purely on price and not on performance and not on environmental performance in particular. And for us, the Biden administration is really changing this by launching the first ever BiClean task force and really harnessing and utilizing the federal government's procurement power with a focus that's not only on price, but on sustainability and resilience. So for me, that's a game changer. And for that reason, we've been a strong supporter of the Biden administration's BiClean initiative and similar initiatives that you walked through that are happening all across the U.S. at the state and local level of governments. So for Holcim, our products like EcoPact, which is a low carbon concrete, and EcoPlanet, which is a low carbon cement, can build stronger and greener and are really the future that we see for the U.S. And for us on the concrete side, our concrete products to meet our own internal BiClean definitions start at a 30% lower embodied carbon compared to the traditional concrete in the market in the U.S. And we can get that up to as high as 70-80% reductions based on utilizing recycled materials and really having a circular look at how we produce construction materials and concrete in particular, and reducing the impact on landfilling of some of those formerly discarded materials. Holcim is also much more than a cement and concrete company. Jetta talked about building emissions, and our solutions and products division, which is focused on roofing, has the ability to drive down embodied and operational emissions by installing new forms of insulation, new types of roofs, green roofs, solar roofs, etc., and the whole building envelope solution for us. So we can build a future that is stronger and greener, and do that with the transparency that's needed to make strong, educated decisions by our customers, and in this case, the government. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks for that, Michael. Josh, would love to hear you weigh in on this question about, well, what EPDs should be doing to actually advance policy making on embodied carbon.
So, Chris, you're putting us in charge of EPA. That's what I'm hearing. This is awesome. We're working with smart people.
I think everybody needs some suggestions right now. As Jetta indicated, I think everybody's looking for some suggestions these days, and I think we're open to ideas.
Yeah, no, and again, thank you for an invitation to the panel. It's an important topic, and I'm so proud to sit with you folks and talk about it, obviously. So my suggestion to the EPA is let's start defining what low carbon means, right? So yes, in certain product types we can. What Megan and Michael have suggested are valuable paths, and I wouldn't say no to any of them, especially some that Megan mentioned in terms of data sets and getting more data out there. The problem is the Inflation Reduction Act, the statement is low carbon. Well, in lots of industries, we don't know what low means, right? And if we all know, sometimes working with government, trying to get that funding out could take years of the process that we have set. The EPA has the 10 years, as Jetta mentioned, not the 4 years, unfortunately, which is now down to like 3.5 for us, of the GSA money. We need to start defining what low carbon means and do it quickly. So while Michael may not like to hear it, some of the money may not go directly to manufacturers, in my opinion. It should go to like industry associations to get some of these industry-wide averages so we can start saying, here's what 20% good looks like, Jetta, right? Here's what 40% looks like. EPA can do that by helping bring better data from industry-wide EPDs that can also start doing some of the data gathering and information gathering that Megan was talking about, right? Where is there gaps in data? Where can we start funding more research and finding more information for primary data that we can utilize? So that would be my main focus. Obviously, would gladly sign on to a lot of what Megan and Michael have talked about as well. But if you had one thing that I would say let's start defining what low carbon means through industry-wide EPDs in areas where we don't have a lot right now.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Josh. I think we have one question from the audience that might kind of touch on that we'll try to come back to a little bit later. We should have plenty of time for Q&A. So I want to take a little bit of a step back, actually, of a sort of a broader strategic question. So, part of the promise of BiClean is shifting the broader market toward lower carbon goods. It's what we're trying to achieve. The Inflation Reduction Act provides additional procurement money to help facilitate that. There are obviously limits to additional funding, especially at the state level. And so I'm wondering what is the potential for BiClean initiatives to really bring about this broader shift in the market, and perhaps what are ideas for states and federal governments to be strategic in their procurement choices to really maximize that potential with the resources they have? Let's go ahead and let's start it off with Michael this time.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I mean, it's a phenomenal question, and as I said, the federal government and governments in general have a tremendous amount of power and power in the purse, and I think for me, from a BiClean perspective, if you look at what New York, which passed a BiClean initiative, or Colorado, which passed a BiClean initiative, or California, which I think passed the first in the country, it was 100% focused around, we need to have good information to make decisions. We need to have transparency in the information that's provided, and we need to have clarity when the government is making decisions about what they're purchasing. And to Josh's point, that you need to have some validity to the data that's there. And I can say for concrete, we've had an industry-wide PCR since 2012, and the PCR process requires regular updating at a frequency of at least every 5 years, and the most recent PCR for concrete is 2021. And I can tell you, between 2012 and 2021, there's been tremendous advancements in the sector. So you need to have those updates that occur on a regular basis. And for Holcim, we don't use industry averages. We use product-specific averages or facility-specific EPDs for our products. So I think there's a lot of people that need to move, as Josh noted, from having no PCR to a industry-specific PCR to industry average EPDs to where our company's at, because transparency and the ability for educated decision making are going to be the primary tools that federal and local and state governments need to have going forward.
Thanks, Michael. And maybe as a quick follow-up on that, I mean, I think we recently talked about the impact that can already be had with existing resources on cement, because a lot of these lower emission mixes are ready and relatively abundant. Could you quickly maybe touch on that? Yeah.
So and this is my opinion, but EPDs are the industry standard tool for measuring embodied carbon and increasing transparency. In reality, they're in their infancy, right? So they've been around for about 3 years. And it's been an evolution, as I said, from evolving from an industry average EPD to product specific or facility specific EPDs, and that's very recent. And so, I think what you have is that there are leaders within the sector. There are a lot of companies that do not have the ability to produce anything today. And so I think that's going to be the evolution is really, and I think that's some of the benefits from the Inflation Reduction Act and the initiatives at GSA. As the government says, this is a metric that you have to have. You must have an EPD, and you must have a product-specific EPD to participate in government procurement, and that gets rolled out across the country. It's going to completely transform the landscape, and we're going to have very significant increases in transparency, and we're going to have very good decisions that come on the procurement side based on the transparency and information that's available in the marketplace.
Thanks so much, Michael. And Josh, actually, I was going to turn to you to see if you would like to jump in on this question.
Yeah, Chris, and thank you for it. I think Michael's on the correct path. I think asking, even if it's not GWP maximums, right? Like a BiClean Act that's actually setting GWP maximums, so like the federal government or other authority having jurisdictions is doing. Marin County, you mentioned, state of Washington has a pilot project now that they're working on that they passed, and other jurisdictions. But simply asking, we have seen transformative nature of asking for information. It started with the LEAD program. The criteria around EPDs, people said, oh, I can get my leads points. And for those that understand, that's an inside joke on people adding an S to lead. But just simply asking for it led to more and more folks like the concrete, cement industry, steel, who said, okay, yeah, we can help and we can start, being transparent about this. So we've also seen Wall Street. I know we don't always like to talk about Wall Street and authorities having jurisdiction crossing over here, but them asking for more carbon data, them asking for scope 1 and 2 at least, asking for ESG information has led to a great deal of interest in just getting the information. So I think an authority having jurisdiction, simply starting the process by saying, hey, along with all the other safety requirements and performance requirements that we have, we're going to start giving extra credit, or we're going to start putting to the top of the list things that have transparency documentation like EPDs or publicly available LCAs or something like this. I do hear from people that say, hey, this is adding a bridge too far for things. Has anyone actually looked at a specification, a procurement specification put out by an authority having jurisdiction? I used to work for UL. The amount of standards that UL and NSF and ASTM have around products, ask Michael. I'm sure Holden is drowning in standards. So adding one more thing to say, hey, be transparent about carbon. I don't think it's a bridge too far anymore, considering the amount of places that are asking.
Thanks for that. And Megan, would love to hear your views as well on sort of this question about, potential for a broader shift in the market and how states and federal governments can be strategic in the way they're designing policies to really maximize that potential.
Yeah, well, first I have to stop picturing 180-page submittals from my days as an architect, since Josh just brought that image back into my head. But I think there's a little bit of a different answer for states and cities versus federal. I mean, I think states and cities really they can now leverage the reporting requirements that the federal government can put forward. I think anything that can reduce the burden on the state and city staff to come up with these requirements on their own is huge. And then I think for the federal government, I think particularly, Jetta touched on, it's going to be tough for them to use all the funding given the short timeline for GSA. And I think that gives them the opportunity to look at performance bonuses, she mentioned advanced purchase agreements or other incentives. So we can really give teams flexibility to look for the most innovative, lowest carbon products, really drive teams to do the work to find those products that are already out there, as Michael has highlighted. And then I think also just the entire, BiClean ecosystem. So this isn't just US, federal, state, and cities, but also international. There's a lot of interest. There's a initiative being led by the UN right now to harmonize international BiClean initiatives. They're all going to be looking to the GSA and the DOT as they implement this program. They're sort of the first that are taking steps to implement the federal BiClean for what worked and how it went. And I think they're going to learn what worked, and then they can also share those findings with others. So I think this really going to support just much better work across the board with this program now in place. Thanks
so much. That was a perfect closer to that round of questions. I'm going to ask, I think, just one more, and then because we've got a lot from the audience, so I will move to audience questions soon. But we are seeing differences in some of the reporting rules among different states and jurisdictions, the BiClean laws and federal agencies. And I'm wondering, it's very possible we're going to continue to see some significant variation there. What are the risks of a patchwork system, and what might we do about it?
We're all ready to jump.
I was gonna say I got like 17.
Let's start with we'll start with Josh, because I haven't yet started with him once, and then we'll start with Josh this time.
Well, that's because we want others to have air to actually speak, Chris. That's why you don't start with me. That's not the best path for you. No. So the thing is, Megan mentioned it. Steal liberally from your friends or people who have done this. Please stop making up new terms in areas that you don't fully understand sometimes. call any of us. We've been involved in this stuff. We have seen a number of things pop up here and there where those of us who have been doing this, 2,000 to 3,000 people on the planet who sort of have been at the basis of this to begin with, are starting to go, hey, wait, what are you trying to do there? So steal liberally, as Megan mentioned, use what the federal government's doing, use what a previous state, learn from their mistakes. Let's not try to reinvent the wheel every time. Let's be consistent so that manufacturers like Michael and others don't have to rip their hair out, right? Because I promise you, I deal with enough manufacturers every day where they're like, so this state wants this and that city wants that and the Fed wants this. And next thing you know, they're just going, nope, I can't do this. Let's steal liberally from our friends. I promise you, Jetta would be glad to share what they come up with. I can almost guarantee it.
Perfect. Let's go to Megan next.
I don't know. I don't have too much to add. I mean, I know that I will say, I think I completely agree. There's been a patchwork so far, and it'll be really interesting to see there's going to be a lot of states proposing or already have proposed legislation this year, and we'll see whether it's any different. There's a federal program, but I think that California putting forth a facility-specific EPD requirement had the effect they wanted it to, and it really started a conversation about supply chain data and primary data from facilities that wasn't happening. And so if we see strong leadership from the EPA on helping improve the data quality and what is required in EPDs, then I don't think we're going to see this patchwork. But if we don't, then it's going to keep happening because, policymakers want to put forth policies that tackle the questions that they're looking for. So Josh is going to have to, say that on panel some more if we don't see some changes. But yeah.
We're all going to have to get on. We're all going to have to talk to more people and be on more calls. Use carbon flying around to talk to people. So let's not do that.
Yeah, heaven forbid anything but that. So Michael, I'd love to close with you on this as someone who's actually responsible for producing all these EPDs. Would love to get your views on this.
Yeah, so I'll offer a couple maybe complementary items. So I'll focus a little bit. As I said before, we're in kind of the infancy of EPD production, and I will give you some dates because it'll help put it into context. So for Holcim, we in March of 2021, so a grand total of 2 years ago, we produced our first ever facility-specific EPDs for cement, and I think we were one of the leading companies in the U.S. to do that. And later in 2021, we started producing on-demand EPDs for our ready-mix concrete products. So you're only talking, this is evolution from 2 years ago. And really both of those initiatives were focused around transparency for our customers. And I'll go back to something that I think Josh said. We probably have 1 in 100 customers that ask for that. So it is very infrequent today, but we have the ability to provide it for the customers that want. And it goes back to the point that I raised earlier around GSA. So as GSA implements these requirements and they trickle through the federal agencies and they become part of state and local procurement, federal procurement, there's going to be a greater and greater demand for them. So we expect to see that grow exponentially on customers that are asking for it. And the focus on EPDs is often climate-related risk. But an EPD can also produce other factual data points that can be used in decision making, things like water consumption, consumption of fresh water per cubic yard of ready-mix concrete as an example, or the amount of waste that happens to be recycled in a cubic yard or cubic yard of ready-mix concrete. So there's a lot of additional data points that come with EPDs that are all focused around improved decision-making and transparency for the decision makers.
Thank you for that, Michael. And with that, I'm actually going to move to some of the questions from the audience because there are a lot of really good ones here. And I'm going to try to get to the meatiest ones. First, we have one that I'll let everybody respond to, but I'm going to give to Megan first. Wondering if you could perhaps expand on some of the issues that exist with current PCRs, and particularly whether additional oversight in the development of them to ensure independence and rigor is needed, what that looks like. So then maybe even more broadly, sort of what might be a government role in doing that. I'm now combining two questions, basically. Start with Megan on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So I think maybe helpful just for this audience. So PCRs are, and Josh can talk to this more than I can, but PCRs are developed by there's sort of, there's the program operator, there's the PCR committee. So there'd be suppliers on that committee that have really relevant experience with that material. There'd also be, Carbon Leadership Forum participates in PCR development. Government policymakers have participated. One great thing that happened after BiClean California is that steel, they joined the steel PCR and were able to advocate for some of how that PCR could better support policy. So that committee is a really key place that government can participate. And there's also PCR review. And so everyone is able to participate in the review of a PCR and submit comments. So I think that those are all areas for potential, oversight and participation. But I think one thing, recently the ACLCA produced a guidance document for PCR quality that has a checklist. So I think using something like that checklist, so we're just making sure everything is following the same standards. And again, making it clear which PCRs do not follow those standards. So if you are, whether you're the federal government or a state or a city or internationally looking at what PCR should be used, you can see whether or not it's met the criteria that's been put forth.
Yeah, Megan, and this is Josh. I would agree with all of that. The two things I would add is Michael mentioned updating, right? You don't want to use a PCR that's from even 6 years ago, right? So giving a consistent term like, hey, we want PCRs from the last 5 years because new innovations within the industry. Additionally, Megan, I want to highlight something, people being involved. Traditionally, PCRs haven't been written from the idea of procurement, right? And again, some of us who were involved with the LEED process, when we originally wrote the EPD criteria within LEED, it was in its nascent stages. As Michael mentioned, when we were writing LEED V4 criteria, the issue there is a lot of the PCRs have been built around LEED requirements. Well, now it's procurement requirements. So we need to look at them to be a little more open in their concept. That includes including things beyond A1 to A3. Potentially going beyond that, including other stages, data quality, different things like that. So, yeah.
Michael, if you want to jump in here, you're welcome to, but I can also move on if you don't want to.
No, the only thing I would add, so I agree 100%. If you want to improve the PCRs, get involved, right? It's an open, transparent process where we fight to get people to be interested and engaged. So get involved and participate. And what I would say is, what I've seen, at least for the concrete PCR, is we've gotten much more on a granular level. So what you look at today versus what was looked at in 2012 has significantly evolved. And I think that's come from an understanding of what data points are necessary and the amount of information that is really necessary to make the educated decisions and the right decisions on what you look at. So and for concrete, I mean, it goes into, it's probably 20, 25, 30 items that are looked at, all the way from cement on one end to admixtures to water, and where the water comes from, I think is probably something that's going to be looked at in the future, whether it's fresh water or recycled. So I think that level of granularity is important, and if you're involved and want to be participating in those efforts, get involved.
Excellent.
Michael, one quick question, Chris. Michael, I have to ask, was that on purpose, granular level for your PCR? I mean, that was just too perfect. That was too perfect.
It's hard to avoid concrete related puns in this field, as we all know. Another great question around sort of data quality. So, we've talked a bit about life cycle assessment, background data. One participant here is asking, what are the best ways to support getting better LCA background data. What role do public and private lifecycle inventory databases have? But yeah, what are the ways to support making that better? Let's start off with Megan again.
I was going to actually ask Josh to start off on this one, and then I'll come.
We can also start with Josh this time.
Just supply your data. Honestly, the more data we have in the marketplace, the more transparency documents, the more the databases get updated, both public and private. Private is certainly ahead. Anywhere there's money, private is going to be ahead. But I know there has been discussion at the federal government level that some of that Inflation Reduction Act money could go to reviving something like the LCI data sets. Those are public commons data sets for the federal government, or federal commons, excuse me. So just keep putting your information out there. I promise those of us involved with the databases are flooding the databases with all the new information. So the more data we get, the better off we'll all be.
Yeah, and I'd add to that. So I think one thing to be clear on, so there is, so example of a public database would be the federal LCA Commons. That is, I know there's discussion about giving that more funding, emphasizing it again here. It's really important to give that more funding. What happens when we have publicly accessible data is that you don't have one PCR, one EPD being created for one set of data and another being created with another, because you can't go and tell a company that they have to pay more for this data versus this other data. And so once it's publicly available, then we don't have to have that. But as Josh said, the private data sets are way ahead right now. And so that's been a real challenge.
Thanks so much for that. And Michael, I don't know if you have anything to add on the data front, but it's, yeah.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is, I think what's changed a little bit. If you went back a decade ago, we were looking at cradle to grave of kind of how you treat the LCA, and for our company, we've shifted to cradle to cradle. So how do we take our end product after, say, we demolish a building, and how do we turn that back into a usable product? And so I think the data is, as was noted, is very much necessary, and having publicly available data that really emphasizes the full life cycle circularity of products, I think is critical to transparency and good decision making.
Perhaps one final question, because I think it might be a quick one, is, what's the potential that we're going to see EPDs expand to building related consumables like heating fuels, paints, and so forth? Maybe even thinking more broadly, what sectors, where we might see EPDs expand?
Already happening, Chris. One of the largest paint manufacturers on the planet, it basically puts out new products with EPDs on it. You're going to get that. I think the next area is going to be the things that save us energy. So HVAC systems, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, MEP. So things like that, I think, are our next area. But we're already getting some of that. Food products are starting to look in the LCA area and produce. It may not be called an EPD in the future, as Megan mentioned.
Yeah, that was kind of my thing, though. I mean, a lot of these things are not going to be called EPDs, right? A lot of
maybe a carbon footprint. Megan, what are the other things you've heard? Michael, have you guys heard? In Europe, there's a PEP, product environmental footprint tool, EPD, but it'll all be based around carbon information or global warming potential impact or something along those lines.
Yeah, and I just highlight that a lot of the, the standards and work around EPDs are specific to construction products. And so that's why, paint, MEP, that's an obvious choice as to what, and that's already happening. I get asked a lot about cars, and also use aluminum and steel. Those are also construction products, but that's a completely different data ecosystem, let's say, that needs to be put forth, and standards for how to create those. And I'm not personally an expert on whether that's moving or when that will move.
Right. So with that, we are out of time, but I want to just thank the panel and Jetta for really excellent insights, and to thank everybody who joined. There's a whole lot of people for a webinar on something as wonky as embodied carbon. So I thank you all for staying with us, and thanks to the panel again, and thank you, Jetta, for a really excellent presentation. And don't forget to email her if you have suggestions on the points that she raised. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, y'all. Happy
Thanks,
New Year.
Chris. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Chris.